Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, as people now start to wonder if Sunak, rather than being just the third worst Prime Minister we've had this Parliament, might not actually be the worst, it's worth revisiting his 5 promises in order to assess whether he ever had any idea what he was doing in the first place. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So when Rishi Sunak was made Prime Minister, most commentators, myself certainly included, viewed him as mostly unsuitable for the role, but at least an improvement on his 2 immediate predecessors. Now, I see some of the same people questioning that. I'm not so sure myself, but it is clear that both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were way better at politics than Sunak. Now, in a way, that shouldn't be a huge surprise. As far as I can tell, Sunak had no interest in politics before becoming a candidate for his party. He won at the first time of asking in a safe seat, and his rise through the ranks was so rapid that he was probably arrogant enough to think he didn't have anything to learn, that his instincts would suffice. And you can certainly imagine someone who was being heavily promoted under Boris Johnson believing that politics was about instinct, not strategy or careful planning. Whereas Boris Johnson took a long run up to politics. Although he would give the impression that he had this instinctive feel for politics, in reality, many years before he even entered politics, he hired people to advise him. He actually sort of took it seriously. And he'd been in frontline politics a long time before becoming Prime Minister. Same with Liz Truss. Now, that's not to say that the Conservatives should or even could have stuck by either of them. It's not so much that Boris Johnson was absolutely going to cost his party the following election, which was clear. It's that he was going to be suspended from Parliament for a long time. As bad as Truss and Sunak have been, it would arguably have been worse for the Tories to allow their leader and Prime Minister to be ejected from Parliament and then go on to lose their own by-election. Vaguely hilarious for the rest of us, but catastrophic for the Conservative Party. Besides, they didn't realise just how awful Truss or Sunak would be. As for Liz Truss, she failed to do enough to restore market confidence quickly enough. There was no way of keeping her in place. Can you imagine where the polls would be now? But when looking at Rishi Sunak, it's clear he just doesn't have the background or experience in politics to have inspired much confidence. And it says a lot about the priorities of Conservative MPs that so many seem to think that a guy with no real political background, but a good money-making one, would be their saviour. And as I've discussed over the last year or so, many of Sunak's failures stemmed from his appeasement of the very people who've wanted him gone since before he even became party leader. The folly of trying to work with people who openly attack you and refuse to compromise. But would he have done any better had he not felt the need to appease the far right? Well, his big New Year's speech at the beginning of 2023 can probably answer that. No. Sunak revealed what he called his and the people's priorities. 5 specific promises: halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists, stop the boats. So let's go through them. Halving inflation. Now, they were able to claim inflation halved by the end of the year, although it was CPI, not core inflation. There were also no government policies which led to it. Sunak's government kept arguing that we needed wage restraint in order to tame inflation, but they kept stoking record corporate profits, which the data shows is a far greater driver of inflation. So in actual fact, Sunak's government worked against their own inflation target, and it was achieved in spite of them, not because of them. In fact, when Sunak made the pledge, economists said, well, this is bound to happen regardless of what you do. The fact that with just a few months to go, we still weren't sure if the target would be met was a sign that Sunak actually made something that should have been easy a close-run thing. Growing the economy went spectacularly badly. We ended the year in recession. This has now been confirmed with the latest figures. In reality, Sunak created this recession. Shouldn't have happened. Recessions are for economies which have a bit of a boom, then a bubble bursts or something. They're not for economies that are bottom feeding, as ours has been since the banking crisis. It was caused because Sunak imposed wage restraints whilst allowing huge rises to essential bills, making people pay more for using, say, the same amount of energy. That doesn't stimulate the economy. You only do that by making people feel better off in real terms so they can buy additional things. So Sunak, with his misguided focus on inflation, deliberately created the conditions whereby the economy was likely to shrink, not grow. The recession was always a risk of his strategy. Now, here's the thing. If you're going to have a strategy to manage inflation which requires people to have real terms income cuts, you know you're risking recession. If you're going to decide that risking recession is affordable politically, then fine. But what you absolutely do not do under these circumstances is promise to grow the economy. So what are we to conclude? Either Sunak didn't realise that his strategy to tackle inflation would risk recession, in which case he doesn't know the basics of economics, nor was he listening to anyone who does. Or did he just not have a strategy to deliver on these promises? Was he just flying by the seat of his pants and made 5 nice sounding promises that he thought would either be easy to achieve or that he could just blag it when he failed, if he failed any of them, when he was called to account? Either way, not a sign of someone with a coherent plan. Then there was reducing debt. Well, this works along the same lines as growing the economy. By suppressing wages but increasing corporate profits whilst at the same time not taxing those corporate profits properly, you are shackling growth. And if you constrain growth, then you are going to struggle to reduce debt. In fact, debt is likely to increase. And because his efforts to reduce inflation were poor, he oversaw a continuing rise in interest rates, meaning that the cost of servicing the growing debt was getting more expensive. So just as with his promise to grow the economy, if he was going to adopt an economic strategy that made debt more likely to increase, not fall, he should not have promised to reduce it. So a second promise which will have sounded good to the public, but which his policies would make all but impossible to achieve. Next was cutting NHS waiting lists. Arguably, that was the dumbest of all. This was the only one of his 5 promises which was entirely within his control. It wasn't based on external factors. He could control that, and he still made things worse. This was the easy one. He would never have reduced waiting lists down to decent levels. Of course, that was impossible. But getting them lower than when he started, lower than the record levels he inherited, that was easy. Come to agreement with NHS workers over pay, and even without any real investment in the NHS, the waiting list would have fallen. But not only did he not come to agreements very quickly, he didn't even try. His health secretary refused to even talk to medical staff about their concerns, and yet was slagging them off in the media. These were the actions of a government which you would think wanted doctors and nurses on strike for some other political purpose, maybe to enact, harsher anti-strike legislation, which is possible. But again, if you're going to adopt a strategy of basically encouraging NHS staff to go on strike, don't say you're going to cut waiting lists, because you're not. The waiting lists were always going to go up at that point. So just as with his economic efforts, his approach to healthcare means that either he didn't understand how strikes would impact waiting lists, or he thought that refusing to even talk to a heavily unionised workforce would somehow get them to drop their concerns and help him get out of a political hole. Either way, not the greatest political thinking. Finally, stop the boats. This is the dumbest of all. There were things he could do to massively reduce channel crossings, but he'd already decided he wasn't going to do them. If he'd set up a processing centre in northern France, which the French authorities were fine with, then there would have been a safe way to claim asylum, meaning refugees don't need to take risks on the channel. And if any small boats did come across anyway, well, when you pick them up, and you pick them all up, you would do what Reform UK reckon they'll do, would take them straight back to France. All perfectly legal because you're taking them to your own facility. Brilliant front pages for the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. Marvellous. Then boost staff to process the claims quickly. But no, instead, Sunak decided to proceed with the Rwanda plan. It's been revealed that Danny Kruger, one of the far-right leaders of the Conservative Party, has been saying that Reform UK are killing his party. But his party created them. Before the Rwanda plan was announced, Reform UK were on 3% of the vote, according to YouGov. Now the same pollster reckons they're on 16%. The Rwanda plan was perfect for Reform UK. It meant that asylum was going to be in the news a lot. The Conservatives were going to be spreading misinformation that played right into Reform UK's hands. And because the Conservatives were essentially declaring that they weren't going to spend time adopting real solutions to the problem, they knew the problem was going to persist. That allowed Reform UK to not only crystallise around this core policy area where they'd been struggling to find a cause before, but they could point out that for all their fancy talk, the Tories were failing to actually make things better. Now, sure, the Rwanda plan was begun by Boris Johnson, and Sunak, as Chancellor at the time, was known to oppose it, but he took it on as Prime Minister. Even at that point, Reform UK were on just 5%. Imagine what might have been the polling situation if Sunak had said, look, this is ridiculous. We're dropping this right now. We're going to focus on credible strategies. We are going to reduce these channel crossings, but we're going to do it with sensible ideas while saying as little as possible in order to prevent the news media having much to say about the matter. Not only would Sunak actually have reduced channel crossings, so could not be accused of failure, but he wouldn't have been turning the issue into a Reform UK friendly culture war. The stop the boat strategy was the dumbest move Sunak made of the lot. Not specifically the promise. He'd have gotten away with that if the numbers were at least falling and you could draw an extrapolation for when they'd end, because he didn't give an end date for when he'd achieve it. But the approach was madness. The Tories would be polling much better now if Reform UK had been denied the oxygen of Tory-inspired culture wars. And Sunak would not be under pressure because he would have done what he set out to do. He would have narrowed the polls considerably, and he could say, and I will carry on narrowing them, and my election campaign will be brilliant. He could have gotten literally everything else wrong, and his party, and therefore his authority, would be more secure without this one utter turnip of a policy. But then imagine if he'd not made the other mistakes either, because they're fairly basic. It's as I kept saying, all Sunak had to do was to stop being just so Tory for like a year. Just 1 year of putting some duct tape over the massive cracks in our country. And do you know what? A lot of people would go, oh, well, things are looking up. Labour a bit of a risk. I'll vote Conservative. Now, Labour may still have retained enough of a poll lead to win the election, but it would not be the territory for the Tories we're looking at now. So they would definitely be in a position to rebuild quite quickly. So my conclusion is, yes, Sunak is weak and appeasement of the far right was a serious error. But even if his party were not so divided, he'd still have messed up because there's clearly been no coherent plan to his premiership at all. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.